So as I started to sort of look at the material online and what Vlad sent me, I started to look at the terms public parking space. And an interesting question for me and for my collaborators in the film group is always, who's the public, right? It's a term that gets thrown around that usually means everybody, but also nobody. Like it's a very general and unspecific term. And one of the things we learned is that that's not the public. The public always needs to be activated. It always needs to be instantiated. Do you know what I mean? Like, you always need to create the public, because otherwise it's an abstract and empty category. The question of space is something that I am very interested in, and I think it's at the core of what's going on in this project. There's something behind me.
Yes.
The public. The question of space. In my thinking about space, I see that space has a lot of relationship to the human body, in the sense that space is always a deeply encoded thing. Every bit of space around us has a meaning, a value, an analog, a metaphor, right? Space is, just as our bodies are always scripted, the way that, let's say, my hand is scripted in a different way from my nose, right? Space is always coded and scripted in different ways. What's very important to me is that in my understanding of public space, as in my understanding of the body, is that there is nothing that is neutral. There are things that are unmarked, right? Parts of the body, potentially, that are unmarked, but they become very quickly marked. And sometimes they're empty spaces, like empty signifiers that are just waiting to be filled, right? That takes me to the third term, which is the parking, the idea of parking. It's always temporary, right? It's always potentially empty, so it's always potentially unmarked, right, and open. And to me, that is the very core of what's going on in this project. The idea of the parking space, I want to unravel a little bit for a minute from the idea of the car, right, which is related to me to the whole, like what we're sitting on, right? It's really a symbol of all of technology, you know, from its simplest, which is the wheel, to the most insidious, right, which is our cell phones and our computers and the internet, and all the ways that all the craft, right, all the technique we use to extend ourselves away from ourselves, right? So I want to put that on the side for a minute, right? And just go back to this idea of the parking space as a space itself, and why it's interesting, and what it might lead to in a conversation, right? To me, when I really look at the parking space in its uninstantiated state, in other words, when it's neither empty nor full, just when it's an idea, right? To me, the parking space has something to do with our unconscious, because you can always see a part of it, but you never see the whole thing, right? Bits, like one of Freud's theories of the unconscious was that bits of your unconscious can come up, right? You can recognize them, but they recede back again, and the whole thing is invisible, right? It's more than we can see. That's why I think the parking space is a real amazing space, modern technological space of pure potentiality. And by pure potentiality, I mean it's a place where anything can happen. Not that everything or anything does happen, but it can. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Matias. Okay, so how I think about parking spaces in a very specific way. I think about it because there's times when I think about losing my job, and I always think about I'm going to live in my car. And when I think about living in my car, I think about all the restrictions that are put on parking your car and keeping it there in the public street. And as there's actually been this thing called an economic crisis, and actually like millionaires have become like smaller millionaires, and some of them have become even richer, but there's all these masses of people who actually are living in their cars. So to me, it's the politics about space, which in our car culture includes parking spaces. So to me, it's about class warfare, about parking spaces. So can I even afford a parking space? Now, I heard this thing on the radio the other day. This guy said, like, a true Angelino does not pay for valet parking. They circle the street and they find that free parking because it's a right of living in Los Angeles that you have free parking. We're not Europeans, we're not from New York, we're not from San Francisco. It is a right that is part of like having oranges in LA, you know? So it's like, that relation is actually part of this class dynamic. LA, in many ways, is shifting from a society where like the space that was kind of part of what was given to the middle class and to the working class is like you can actually park your car places, is actually becoming privy to people who can afford parking lots and can buy that loft and buy the parking lot, the parking space that goes with the loft, you know, versus that was part of like the middle class right. So this is how I try to relate to parking spaces and the restrictions that they're putting. Like I live in Eagle Rock, and right around the corner of me on Colorado, they've actually started putting like restrictions. You can't park your car between 10 and 5 in the morning. And why they do that is because a lot more people are actually living in their cars. So to me, parking space is not really, I mean, sure, I understand there's an aesthetic and there's a place because galleries are closing down and people need to like perform somewhere, you gotta do your thing. But in reality, it's like, I'm kind of want to live in I want to have some place to live in my car in LA and not just have to go live out in Rialto, really far out, you know, San Bernardino County with all the other like, you know, working class population that's been kicked out of LA because of gentrification. So that's how I think about parking and parking space. And with that, I think about how can I be active about it? How can I resist this whole process about parking spaces? So that's my spiel. I'll hand it over to actually people who deal with the concrete politics and policy about how this city is being planned and people who are actually fighting back other than just I'm going to go slash a tire of a cop.